There are moments in life when it feels like everything is working against you. You try, you push, you pray, but no matter what you do, it seems like you keep falling short. You set goals, you step out in faith, you do your best, but somehow you keep hitting a wall. And if you're not careful, you'll start believing a lie. The lie that says, I'm failing. But I came to tell you today, you are not failing. Just because you're struggling doesn't mean you're failing. Just because you're in a battle doesn't mean you're losing. Just because you don't see results right now doesn't mean God isn't working. See, the enemy wants you to believe that failure is final. He wants you to look at your mistakes, your disappointments, your setbacks, and conclude that you're not good enough, that you're not strong enough, that you'll never get it right. But let me remind you of something. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of it. Every great person in Scripture went through moments when they felt like they were failing. Think about Peter. He was bold, passionate, full of faith, but he also sank when he tried to walk on water. He denied Jesus 3 times. He made mistakes. But did Jesus say, Peter, you're a failure? No, Jesus looked at Peter and saw his potential. He said, on this rock I will build my church. What if the thing you're calling failure is actually the foundation God is using to build something greater? See, you have to change how you see failure. Failure isn't proof that God has abandoned you. It's proof that He's preparing you. You don't need to run from it. You don't need to be ashamed of it. You need to learn from it. Because the only way you truly fail is if you quit. Some of you are on the verge of quitting. You've been fighting for your marriage, but nothing seems to change. You've been praying for breakthrough in your finances, but the bills keep piling up. You've been trying to overcome that addiction, but you keep slipping back into old habits. And the voice in your head says, what's the point? It's not working. But let me ask you something. Who told you that? Who told you you're failing? Who told you it's over? Who told you God is done with you? Because I know it wasn't God. God doesn't speak in the language of failure. He speaks in the language of grace. He speaks in the language of purpose. He speaks in the language of victory. The Bible says in Philippians 1:6, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. That means God doesn't start something He doesn't intend to finish. If He called you, He's going to complete the work in you. If He gave you the dream, He's going to bring it to pass. If He put that purpose inside of you, He's not going to let failure have the final say. But you have a choice. You can focus on what's not working, or you can focus on the one who is still working. You can focus on your mistakes, or you can focus on God's mercy. You can focus on how far you have to go, or you can focus on how far He's already brought you. Sometimes the reason we feel like we're failing is because we're measuring success the wrong way. We think success means everything goes smoothly. We think success means we never make mistakes. But real success isn't about avoiding failure. It's about persevering through it. David had to face Goliath. Moses had to face Pharaoh. Joseph had to face the pit before he made it to the palace. And Jesus had to face the cross before He walked out of the tomb. If Jesus had to go through some things, what makes you think you won't? But here's the good news. Just like Jesus got up, just like Joseph rose to power, just like David defeated Goliath, you will rise. You will overcome. You will make it. Not because you're perfect, not because you never fall, but because God is with you and He is greater than anything that comes against you. Some of you need to stop calling it failure and start calling it training. Stop calling it defeat and start calling it development. Stop calling it over and start calling it preparation. What looks like failure right now might just be the setup for the greatest breakthrough of your life. You may not see it yet, but God is working behind the scenes. He's strengthening you. He's shaping you. He's teaching you to trust Him, because when you come out of this, you won't just survive, you'll thrive. You're not failing, you're learning. You're growing, you're being positioned for something greater. So get back up, keep believing, keep trusting, keep moving forward, because what God started in you, He will finish. Struggles and setbacks don't mean you're failing, they mean you're learning and growing. Just because things aren't happening on your timeline doesn't mean God has abandoned you. He completes what He starts. Mistakes don't define you, but giving up does. Perseverance is the key to breakthrough. Stop seeing it as a sign to quit and start seeing it as preparation for something greater. God is using every challenge to strengthen you, position you, and prepare you for what's next. Keep trusting, keep believing, and keep moving forward. People often think that success is the absence of failure, that winning means never falling, never making mistakes, never struggling. But that's not how success works. Success isn't the opposite of failure, it's built on failure. Every great achievement, every breakthrough, every moment of victory comes from a journey that includes setbacks, disappointments, and moments of doubt. Look at anyone who has ever accomplished something significant. They didn't get there because they never failed. They got there because they refused to let failure define them. They saw failure as a lesson, not a label. They understood that just because something didn't work the first time or the second time or even the 10th time, it didn't mean they were unqualified. It just meant they were still in the process. God never promised a life without obstacles. He never said that faith would make everything easy. In fact, Jesus said the opposite. In this world, you will have trouble. He warned us that challenges would come, that storms would hit, that opposition would rise. But He also gave us a promise. Take heart. I have overcome the world. That means no matter how many times you fall, no matter how many setbacks you face, you are never beyond redemption, never beyond restoration, never beyond the reach of God's power. Think about Peter. He was passionate, bold, ready to step out in faith, but he also made mistakes. He tried to walk on water and sank. He promised Jesus he would never deny Him, then denied Him 3 times. He had moments where he got it wrong. But Jesus never called Peter a failure. He called him a rock. He called him a leader. He saw something in Peter that Peter couldn't even see in himself. Maybe that's where you are right now. You look at your life and all you see are the ways you've fallen short. You see the job you didn't get, the business that didn't work out, the dream that hasn't come to pass. And the enemy whispers in your ear, see, you're a failure. But that's not what God says. God says, I'm still working. I'm not finished with you. What you see as failure, I see as preparation. There is no success story without struggle. Look at Joseph. God gave him a dream that one day he would be a leader, but before he reached the palace, he went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and prison. At any point, Joseph could have thought, I must have heard God wrong. If I was really called, this wouldn't be happening. But the setbacks weren't proof that he wasn't called. They were part of the process to get him to where God wanted him to be. We want the victory without the battle. We want the breakthrough without the process. But God doesn't skip steps. He uses every difficulty to shape us, to refine us, to prepare us for what's ahead. What feels like failure right now might actually be training. What feels like rejection might be redirection. What feels like the end of the road might just be the beginning of something greater than you imagined. Sometimes we define success by the wrong standards. We think success means never making mistakes, always having everything together, always being on top. But that's not how God measures success. He looks at faithfulness. He looks at perseverance. He looks at the person who keeps showing up, who keeps believing, who keeps trusting, even when things don't go as planned. David was anointed king as a young boy, but he didn't step into that position immediately. He spent years being overlooked, running for his life, facing enemies on every side. But every battle he fought, every hardship he endured prepared him for the throne. If he had given up when things got hard, he never would have stepped into his destiny. Some of you are in that place right now. You're facing opposition and you're wondering, God, where are you? Why isn't this working? But just because it's hard doesn't mean you're failing. Just because you're struggling doesn't mean you're off track. God is strengthening you. He's building something in you that can't be shaken. Failure isn't final unless you let it be. Falling doesn't disqualify you. Struggling doesn't mean you're not called. It means you're in process. It means you're learning. It means God is still working in you. What you see as failure might just be the foundation for your greatest victory. Keep going, keep trusting, keep believing. God is not finished yet. One of the greatest struggles in life is trusting that God is working even when you don't see any evidence of it. It's easy to believe when everything is going right, when prayers are being answered quickly, when doors are opening and opportunities are falling into place. But what about when nothing seems to be happening? What about when you've been praying and believing, but all you feel is silence? What about when you've been faithful, but your situation hasn't changed? That's when doubt starts creeping in. That's when the enemy starts whispering, maybe God isn't really working. Maybe he's forgotten about you. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean he isn't doing something. God is always working, even when it's not obvious. Just because you don't have visible proof right now doesn't mean he isn't setting things up behind the scenes. Faith isn't about seeing, it's about trusting. It's about believing that God is doing something even in the silence, even in the waiting, even when nothing makes sense. Think about a seed planted in the ground. When a farmer plants a seed, he doesn't stand over the soil and panic because he doesn't see anything happening the next day. He knows that growth is taking place beneath the surface even though he can't see it yet. He knows that the roots are spreading, the seed is breaking open, and life is forming. It's only a matter of time before the plant begins to push through the soil. But if he gives up too soon, if he stops watering it, if he digs it up out of frustration, he'll never see the harvest. That's how God works. Just because you don't see results right now doesn't mean nothing is happening. Some of the most powerful things God does in your life start beneath the surface. He's strengthening you in ways you don't realize. He's aligning things in ways you can't see. He's preparing you for what's ahead, even though you may feel stuck. Think about the story of Joseph. God gave him a dream that he would be a great leader. But instead of stepping into that dream immediately, he found himself betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years, it looked like nothing was happening. It looked like everything was going in the opposite direction of the promise. But God was working behind the scenes the entire time. Every setback was actually setting him up for something greater. If Joseph had judged God's faithfulness based on what he could see, he might have given up. He might have assumed that God had forgotten about him, but God had not abandoned him. He was preparing him. What seemed like wasted years were actually years of training. And when the time was right, in a single moment, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. That's what God can do. He can shift things in an instant. He can take years of struggle and turn them into something greater than you ever imagined. But you have to trust him in the process. You have to believe that even in the silence, even in the delays, he is still working. Sometimes God's timing is different from ours because he's not just working on the situation, he's working on us. We think we're ready for the breakthrough, but God knows there are things he needs to develop in us first. He knows the weight of the blessing we're praying for, and he's strengthening us so we'll be able to handle it. He knows that if he gave it to us too soon, we might not be ready. That's why the waiting season isn't wasted. It's in the waiting that God teaches us to rely on him. It's in the waiting that our faith is strengthened. It's in the waiting that he removes things that could be holding us back. And when the time is right, when we're ready, when everything is aligned, he moves in ways we never saw coming. If you're in a season where it feels like nothing is happening, don't mistake God's silence for his absence. He hasn't left you. He hasn't forgotten you. He is working all things together for your good, even if you can't see it yet. He is making a way where there seems to be no way. He is moving pieces into place that you don't even know about. Your job is to keep trusting, keep believing, and keep walking in faith, knowing that in his perfect time, he will bring everything together exactly as he promised. The difference between success and failure isn't perfection, it's perseverance. The people who accomplish great things in life aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who refuse to quit. The only way to truly fail is to give up. As long as you keep going, as long as you keep trusting, as long as you keep putting one foot in front of the other, God can still use you, restore you, and bring you into everything he has planned for you. One of the biggest lies the enemy wants you to believe is that your mistakes disqualify you. He wants to convince you that because you messed up, because you fell short, because you didn't get it right the first time, you might as well stop trying. He wants to fill your mind with doubt, shame, and regret so that you'll walk away from the very thing God called you to. But failure isn't what disqualifies you. Quitting is. Think about Peter. He had a moment of complete failure when he denied Jesus 3 times. He had walked with Jesus, witnessed his miracles, and even boldly declared that he would never turn his back on him. But when the pressure was on, Peter caved. He did the very thing he swore he wouldn't do. At that moment, he must have felt like an absolute failure. He could have given up. He could have decided that he wasn't worthy of being used by God. But that's not what happened. After Jesus rose from the dead, he restored Peter and gave him an even greater assignment. Peter went on to preach the gospel and become a foundational leader in the early church. What if Peter had quit? What if he had let his failure define him? What if he had walked away and believed the lie that he wasn't good enough? He would have missed out on his destiny. He would have never seen the fulfillment of God's plan for his life. That's what the enemy wants for you. To convince you that because you failed, because things haven't gone the way you hoped, you might as well stop trying. But God isn't finished with you yet. The Bible is full of people who could have given up but didn't. Moses doubted himself and made mistakes, but he still led the Israelites out of Egypt. David fell into sin, but God still used him as a man after his own heart. Paul persecuted Christians before his encounter with Jesus, but he became one of the greatest apostles of all time. The common thread in all of these stories isn't perfection, it's perseverance. They kept going. They didn't let failure be the final word. Some of the greatest victories in life come to those who refuse to quit. The enemy will do everything he can to convince you that it's over, that there's no point in trying again, that you'll never recover from your mistakes. But what if the breakthrough you've been praying for is just on the other side of your persistence? What if the only thing standing between you and what God has for you is your willingness to keep going? Failure isn't final unless you let it be. Every time you fall, you have a choice. You can stay down or you can get back up. Proverbs 24:16 says, the righteous may fall 7 times, but they rise again. Notice that it doesn't say the righteous never fall. It says they get back up. That means falling isn't what makes you a failure. Staying down is. Getting up again is what makes you victorious. Sometimes we quit too soon because we don't see progress. We expect things to change overnight, and when they don't, we assume it's not working. But just because you don't see the results yet doesn't mean nothing is happening. Growth takes time, healing takes time, breakthrough takes time, and the people who see the promises of God fulfilled in their lives are the ones who keep believing even when they don't see immediate results. God's plan for your life is bigger than your failures. His purpose for you is greater than your mistakes. He isn't expecting you to be perfect. He's expecting you to trust Him. And trusting Him means refusing to quit even when things don't go as planned. It means holding on to His promises even when circumstances try to tell you otherwise. It means getting back up time and time again, knowing that God is still working. The only way to truly fail is to give up. As long as you keep going, as long as you keep trusting, as long as you refuse to quit, God can still bring you into everything He has for you. Your story isn't over. Your best days are still ahead. God is not done with you yet. The way you see failure determines how you respond to it. If you see it as the end, you'll stop trying. If you see it as evidence that you're not good enough, you'll start doubting yourself. If you see it as a reason to quit, you'll never reach the purpose God has for you. But if you shift your perspective, if you start seeing failure not as a dead end, but as a stepping stone, it will change everything. The enemy wants you to believe that failure is proof that you're unqualified, that you've messed up too much, that you'll never get it right. But God never defines you by your failures. He defines you by His grace. He sees beyond your mistakes and looks at your potential. He knows that the very thing you're calling failure might actually be the thing He's using to strengthen you. Think about the story of Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses immediately started listing all the reasons he wasn't qualified. He had a past. He had made mistakes. He had failed before. He didn't see himself as a leader. He saw himself as someone who had already failed too many times to be used by God. But God didn't see him that way. God knew that every experience Moses had gone through, even the painful ones, had been preparing him for the calling ahead. If Moses had let his past failures define him, he never would have stepped into his destiny. So much of what we call failure is simply a matter of perspective. What one person sees as a setback, another person sees as an opportunity to learn. What one person sees as rejection, another person sees as redirection. The difference isn't the situation, it's how you choose to see it. If you believe that failure means you're not good enough, you'll stay stuck. But if you believe that failure is a part of growth, you'll use it as fuel to keep going. The Bible is full of people who failed, but God didn't see them as failures. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but Jesus still chose him to be a leader in the early church. David made huge mistakes, but God still called him a man after his own heart. Paul started out persecuting Christians, but God transformed him into one of the greatest apostles. Their failures didn't disqualify them because they didn't let their failures define them. God doesn't waste anything, not even your mistakes. He uses every experience, every setback, every challenge to shape you into the person He's called you to be. Sometimes the things you thought were holding you back are actually the things preparing you for what's ahead. The lessons you learn in failure are often the lessons that equip you for success. Think about an athlete training for a race. If they stumble during practice, they don't quit. They learn from it. They figure out what they need to adjust. They get stronger. They build endurance. Every time they fall, they learn how to get back up faster. That's how growth works. You don't get stronger by avoiding failure. You get stronger by pushing through it. There are things God is developing in you that you wouldn't learn if everything always went smoothly. Patience is developed through waiting. Strength is built through resistance. Faith is strengthened in the seasons when you have to trust even when you don't see results. If everything always worked out perfectly the first time, you wouldn't learn perseverance. You wouldn't learn resilience. You wouldn't learn to depend on God. Sometimes what looks like failure is actually protection. You might be upset because something didn't work out the way you wanted, but what if God was protecting you from something you couldn't see? What if the job you didn't get would have taken you down the wrong path? What if the relationship that didn't work out was actually making room for something better? What if the closed door was actually God redirecting you towards something greater? The way you see failure determines how you respond to it. If you see it as the end, you'll stop trying. But if you see it as part of the process, you'll keep going. You'll trust that God is still working. You'll believe that He's using every experience to shape you for what's ahead. Your perspective matters. The only real failure is letting your mistakes define you instead of letting God use them to develop you. What feels like your greatest struggle right now might actually be the setup for your greatest comeback. The things that seem to be working against you could be the very things God is using to position you for something greater. It's easy to get discouraged when you're in the middle of a battle, when you're facing obstacles, when it feels like nothing is going right. But what if the struggle isn't a sign that you're failing? What if it's proof that God is preparing you for something bigger than you imagined? Joseph had a dream that one day he would be in a position of leadership. But before he ever saw that dream fulfilled, he went through a series of painful setbacks. His brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison. For years, his life seemed to be moving in the opposite direction of what God had promised. But what Joseph didn't realize in those moments was that every single hardship was setting him up for his purpose. If he had never been sold into slavery, he never would have ended up in Egypt. If he had never been thrown into prison, he never would have met the person who introduced him to Pharaoh. And if he had never met Pharaoh, he never would have stepped into the position God had planned for him. It didn't make sense while he was in it. It felt unfair. It felt like failure. But what looked like a series of losses was actually a setup for something greater. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated to a position of influence, and he was able to save an entire nation from famine. The very things that could have destroyed him were the things that positioned him for his destiny. That's how God works. He takes what was meant for evil and turns it for good. He takes the seasons of struggle and uses them to prepare you for the blessings ahead. He allows certain challenges in your life, not to break you, but to build you. He knows that what you're facing right now is producing strength, endurance, and faith in you that you'll need for the next season. David was anointed to be king at a young age, but he didn't step into that role immediately. Before he ever wore the crown, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, and facing opposition on every side. There were moments when it looked like the promise on his life would never come to pass. But every battle, every hardship, every delay was shaping him into the leader God had called him to be. When the time came for him to step into his destiny, he was ready. Not because everything had been easy, but because the struggle had prepared him. Sometimes the struggle isn't a sign that God has forgotten about you. It's a sign that He's getting you ready. It's a sign that He's refining you, strengthening you, and positioning you for what's next. If you could see what He's setting up for you behind the scenes, you wouldn't be discouraged. You would trust that He's working all things together for your good, even the things that don't make sense right now. When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, it might look like nothing is happening on the outside. It might seem like a season of darkness, of waiting, of being stuck. But inside that cocoon, transformation is taking place. The struggle the caterpillar goes through to break out of the cocoon isn't just a challenge, it's necessary. The fight to push through is what strengthens its wings so it can fly. Without the struggle, it wouldn't be able to step into its purpose. The same is true for you. The struggle isn't for nothing. The pressure you're feeling, the obstacles you're facing, the battles you're fighting, they're strengthening you. They're equipping you for what's ahead. God wouldn't allow it if He wasn't going to use it. He wouldn't let you go through it if He didn't have a purpose for it. The enemy wants you to believe that this struggle is the end of your story. He wants you to think that the hardship you're facing is proof that you'll never get to where God is calling you. But God is saying this is not the end. This is the setup. This is the training ground. This is the preparation for something greater. If you don't quit, if you keep trusting, if you keep moving forward even when it's hard, you'll see that what the enemy meant for harm, God is using for your good. You'll see that every tear, every struggle, every setback was actually positioning you for a comeback. You may not understand it now, but one day you'll look back and realize that the very thing you thought was breaking you was actually building you. There comes a moment in every struggle, in every journey, when you have to make a decision. You can let the weight of failure, disappointment, and delay convince you to give up, or you can choose to trust that God is still working. You can allow your setbacks to define you, or you can believe that they are part of a greater process that is shaping you into the person you were meant to be. You can choose to walk away in discouragement, or you can stand firm in faith, knowing that even if you don't see it yet, your breakthrough is on the way. Every great story has moments of tension, moments where it seems like all hope is lost, moments where the main character faces impossible odds. But the reason those stories are powerful is because they don't end in defeat. The challenges, the struggles, the moments of near failure are what make the victory so much greater in the end. The same is true for your life. What feels like an impossible situation right now is not the end of your story. It's a chapter. It's a scene in the middle of what God is still writing. And if you give up now, you'll never see how it all comes together. Some of the greatest blessings in life come disguised. The job you lost, the relationship that didn't work out, the opportunity that fell through. It may have felt like failure at the time, but what if it was actually God protecting you? What if it was God redirecting you? What if it was never rejection, but preparation? We often don't understand why things happen the way they do in the moment, but If we could see the full picture, we would realize that God was always leading us exactly where we needed to be. When Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on water, he started strong. He had enough faith to take that first step. But as soon as he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. The circumstances around him made him forget what had been true from the beginning. Jesus had called him, and Jesus wasn't going to let him drown. But even in his moment of doubt, even in his moment of sinking, Jesus reached out his hand and lifted him up. That's the grace of God. Even when you feel like you're failing, even when you feel like you're sinking, he is right there reaching out his hand. You are not alone in this struggle. You are not forgotten in this season. You have not missed your chance. If you have breath in your lungs, then God is not done with you yet. He is still working, still leading, still guiding. Maybe you've convinced yourself that you're too far gone, that you've made too many mistakes, that you've missed too many opportunities. But God is a God of restoration. He specializes in taking what looks broken and making it whole. He takes what seems lost and redeems it. He takes what the enemy meant for harm and turns it into something greater than you ever imagined. The only thing that can stop you from stepping into that is believing the lie that it's too late for you. Failure is not final. A delay is not a denial. What looks like a setback is often a setup for something better than you had planned. The problem is we tend to judge our lives based on what we can see right now. But God sees the full picture. He sees what's coming next. He sees the doors he's about to open, the ways he's about to move, the things he's been preparing for you all along. It's easy to have faith when everything is going well. It's easy to believe in the promise when the path is clear. But true faith is trusting even when you don't see it yet. True faith is believing even when it feels like nothing is happening. True faith is saying, God, I don't understand, but I trust you anyway. I don't see the answer yet, but I know you're working. I don't know how this will turn out, but I know you are faithful. Some of the greatest victories in life come to those who simply refuse to quit. The enemy would love nothing more than for you to give up before you see the fulfillment of what God has for you. He wants you to throw in the towel just before your breakthrough. He wants you to walk away in discouragement right before your promise comes to pass. But you have to hold on. You have to keep believing. You have to remind yourself that God has never failed you before, and he won't start now. If you look back on your life, you'll see moments where you thought it was over, but somehow God made a way. You'll remember times when you thought you wouldn't recover, but here you are. You'll realize that even in the hardest seasons, even in the moments when you thought you had failed beyond repair, God was still working. And if he was faithful then, he will be faithful now. Don't let what you see right now convince you that God isn't moving. Don't let the waiting season make you believe that nothing is happening. A seed that is planted doesn't produce fruit overnight. It takes time. It takes watering. It takes trust that even though you don't see the growth yet, it's happening beneath the surface. You are not failing. You are growing. You are learning. You are becoming the person God has created you to be. Every struggle, every setback, every delay is shaping you. And if you refuse to give up, if you keep trusting, if you keep moving forward, even when it's hard, you will see the promise. You will see the breakthrough. You will see that everything you went through was leading you to exactly where you were meant to be.